Yeah, so you can structure that in a similar way where it's essentially a cashless transaction in which he pays for the shares with a promissory note. Really, what's happening is the promissory note is getting issued at the same time the shares are, and no cash really changes hands. Now, the promissory note is going to have a minimum interest rate, and there are some other sort of tax-driven concerns with the promissory note. So, for instance, he's going to need to pledge the shares that he receives in exchange for the note as collateral for the note. And the note's also going to have to be at least 50% recourse, which means that the company, he is personally liable for 50% of the outstanding principal and interest accrued on the note. Otherwise, what it really becomes is an option because he's getting, doesn't have to pay for the note, and he's getting shares in exchange, and he can choose at a later time not to pay and just give his shares back in exchange for the note. So for the note not to be deemed an option, we need to have this recourse feature.
I think there's actually, I think that there's 4 different common mechanics for that. One is the mechanic that Mark just articulated, that is, the shares are paid by a debt that is owed to the company. The downside of that is, what happens if that founder leaves? The founder, that note is accelerated, the founder's gonna have to come up with that cash, you have debt on your books. Optically, some investors don't like having the company owe founders money. So there's gonna be pros and cons to each. Another mechanism is you just grant him an option. You get a valuation and you grant him an option, and he has all the rights that are inherent to an option. Downside to that is you're gonna have to pay for a third-party valuation. Option 3 is you just give him the stock. You gift him the stock and it's deemed compensation. So there's tax to him on that. So there's withholding and reporting obligations, but that's the value of the stock. In other words, if the stock was worth $1 a share, let's say you were just giving it to him as effectively a signing bonus, instead of having to pay $1 a share, he'd have to pay about 40 cents to cover the withholding or reporting obligation. The reason you need a third-party valuation for options is to comply with 409A, which we can talk about separately. 409A does not apply to stock. So you still have to identify what the fair market value is. The board can determine that. Option 4 is a similar construct, but what you do is if you have revenue and you have cash in the bank, you bonus him cash. That cash is going to be taxed as compensation. He could use that bonus for whatever he wants, including buying the shares. There's pros and cons to all of these. Most of them are all going to be tax driven, but there are a variety of issues. The cleanest way typically to do that is just to go the option route. Get a valuation and do an option. If you're in revenue and you're going to be hiring folks, I suspect you're going to be running into this issue with every hire subsequent to this. Typically in a company at this stage that's been around, you have funding, or at least if you're in revenue, typically they would pay the $3,000 to $5,000 to get the third-party valuation so that you can grant options to everybody else.